Sierra celebrated 75 years of independence, and assumed the B20 Secretariat in 2022-23, it reached new milestones in the service of Indian industry. For the theme, Beyond India at 75, Competitiveness, Growth,
If I may request all to be please seated. A very warm welcome and good afternoon to this inaugural session of the CII Roundtable on reviving growth with inclusivity. And it's my honor and a privilege to very specially welcome our chief guest, Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman ji, the Honorable Minister for Finance and Corporate Affairs for the Government of India, for coming and inaugurating this roundtable on reviving growth with inclusivity, as I mentioned, is being held in the sidelines of the 2023 annual meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. It will not be out of place for me to start by saying congratulations and complimenting the Government of India for a phenomenal success at the G20 presidency with some of the most outstanding outcomes for the global community. And Madam Finance Minister, she leading the finance track has been a very, very significant contribution for over the last many months, the way we have seen. And going back from the Indian industry, the way we have been able to work with her ministry and the government has been a special privilege for everyone in the Indian industry. And she has been a go-to person, if I can say, of the businesses in India and the patient listening. Sometimes we have been talking to her and her system, her ministry, about many issues. I'm going back a couple of years during the COVID times, and sometimes she has listened, sometimes she has even told us what's possible and not possible. And during the course of those interactions, we remember we getting edgy in the Indian businesses to say, this should be done, this should be done, we should push the finance minister much more to get something done. But the way she handled it, later on, after the COVID was over and we saw the Indian economy moving on that fast track, we felt that, thank God, she didn't listen to many things that we had said. Madam Finance Minister, thank you very much for your leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, this conference is being guided a lot by our, as you see, Mr. N.K. Singh, who has been one who has been, if I can say, over decades a mentor to me, of course, and to our institution, and in many, many hats that he has worn over the last many years. And we are indeed very, very privileged today that you have really helped us have this very important and a significant discussion where we have the presence of our Honorable Finance Minister during a very busy schedule in Marrakech. And Mr. Singh, who is the co-convener of the G20 Independent Expert Group on Reforms in the MDBs, along with Mr. Larry Summers, who unfortunately is not present, and we really want to accord a very, very warm welcome to you, Mr. Singh. Thank you very much for being with us here today. We also have with us, of course, our Ambassador, Mr. Rajesh Vaishnav. Again, thank you, Ambassador. Welcome to you. And we have our Secretary of the Department of Economic Affairs, Mr. Ajay Seth, also present in the audience. Welcome to you, Mr. Seth. Thank you for being with us. And, of course, our Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran, present with us. So we have a strong team from the Government of India and two very, very expert present here in the panel, Dr. Hans-Peter Langes from the LSE Oxford International Growth Center, and of course, Mr. Donald Kaberuka, the former president of the African Development Bank and the managing partner of the Southbridge Group. A hearty welcome also to each one of you, ladies and gentlemen, for being a part of this important and significant roundtable that we are having here today. To our international partners, I just wanted to mention one thing. We've all heard about the huge success of India's presidency of the G20. I just wanted to humbly also mention that the B20, the Business 20, which has a lot of relevance to this meeting today, has been working very, very strongly over the last 1 year to work on some of the very important subjects that we are going to touch today. And we had been able to work on 54 strong recommendations and 172 odd policy enablers, which we presented to our leadership. And I must say, a major recommendation was on financing global economic recovery in a manner where the businesses of the 20+ countries got together. And the progress, one of the things that really came out was the progress towards the SDGs as we all know, being behind schedule, and there being huge gaps in SDGs financing, which continues to rise today and to rise over time. And the challenge then, therefore, that was discussed is to look for innovative solutions to secure the vast resources that we have required for achieving these SDGs. And I'm saying this because that really calls for, indeed, a coordinated actions by governments, the MDBs, the private sector, and all other stakeholders across countries. And the B20 suggested that to leverage private capital, which in association with the public institution could help bridge the SDG funding, the gap, and the B20 India therefore suggested a fund where the G20 countries in an appropriate proportion of their GDP and the private sector could come into play. That the Indian model for funding corporate social responsibility very strongly engages the private sector to address the societal and environmental concerns. And there is a 2% that Indian corporates do contribute towards it. And for instance, in 2020-21, medium and the large sector corporates allocated somewhere around 3.3 billion US for corporate social responsibility activities. So we are looking for a pathway that rebuilds economies, bring health to all, alleviates people at the margins, and builds a long-term resilience and sustainability with very special focus on the global south. And to light the path, we require a unique blend of private capital supplemented by public funds. One very key outcome of the B20 process was this thought process that came up. And the key initiative was really to get this going in an institutionalized manner, which we put up for consideration. And your feedback and the inputs of our very strong experts with our chief guest, Madam Finance Minister, we will put it up to you for your inputs on it. I really urge that all this very august gathering present in this hall today works along together. We will, as an institution, be connected to seek your inputs, your thoughts, your advice on how we could all really work towards some of these suggestions which can be of value to us as we go along. With that, I'd like to once again welcome all of you to this session on reviving growth with inclusivity, and we would really look forward to our expert views, especially led by our honorable chief guest, the Finance Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here with us. May I now request Mr. R. Dinesh, the President of CII and the Chairman and Managing Director of the TVS Logistics, to please give his remarks, please.
Honorable Finance Minister, dignitaries of the dais, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Let me add a very warm welcome on behalf of CII to the Honorable Finance Minister of India, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, for joining us today on yet another occasion where we speak about how do we shape the future. The fundamental issue which I think we are trying to cover is how do we manage to sustain growth while at the same time meeting the sustainability development goals which all of us have set for ourselves. And equally importantly, how do we attract private capital to follow, and if not follow, even actually go to the extent of standing side by side with the requirements of the institutional funding required. I would like to make 5 specific suggestions. The first is a follow-up to what CB already mentioned in terms of how we ensure a fund is created in which the private capital also participates as part of what I would call a CSR initiative. We had suggested that 0.2% of the profits of medium and large corporates can actually be used to give a seed capital, which can then create approximately a $100 billion fund. And this can be linked to the per capita GDP of the countries so that we get the funding from the countries as well as from the corporates. The second is to make sure that we actually put infra projects into select return buckets with a risk-weighted matrix which can be published by the multilateral institutions, and this can actually help calibrate the return expectations which the long-term sovereign funds and the private sector can aspire to get for and which can be supported. In this context, I think I am actually using a statement which was made by the Honorable Prime Minister when he came for the B20 event, when he actually said that there may be a little bit of future profits to be secured as long as we're ready to give current profits away for a short period of time. So I think this is where this weighted matrix can help enable corporates to also participate in the growth of the requirements of the sustainability development goals. The third would be a public-private partnership for supporting the utilization of the infrastructure which is going to be created to make sure that the SDGs are further met and the visibility of implementation. Here again, there are various digital tools, and again India has been a forerunner in terms of doing that with the Gati Shakti program, of making sure that these are made visible for every funder so that they are aware as to at each stage of the process where they are. And even if the multilateral institutions are initially playing the seed capital, corporate capital can follow because they are reasonably confident that timelines will be met and there is transparency in terms of the process being adopted. Finally, to make sure that we support the MSMEs in their process of the sustainability development goals and also develop the digital infrastructure required for them to make this happen, large corporates can actually be the conduit for not only the seed capital to come in for multilateral institutions, but also make sure that necessary funding is made available to help them in this transition journey. With these, I very much look forward to what we are going to hear from the rest of the speakers today and making sure we can continue to work together both from an industry side to make the action happen at the ground so that we see the reality of it sooner rather than later. Thank you and look forward to today.
Thank you very much, Dinesh, for that industry perspective from your side. It's now my honor and privilege to invite and request our Honorable Finance Minister, Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman ji, to give the keynote address, please.
Good evening, and on a very beautiful day for me in Marrakech, cloudy, the harshness of the sun gone, gentle drizzle, adding to the beautiful, what I may call a pink landscape which I see in Marrakech with all the tall palms, actually finishing the picture that I had, mind picture that I had of Marrakech. Although I've been to Morocco twice before, I have not come to Marrakech. So this is my first visit, and it's such a beautiful place. It leaves a lasting impression in your mind, and I'll certainly fondly carry that back home. But before I start, I would want to share a moment in condoling the deaths and also the property lost because of the earthquake. Quietly and resolutely, Morocco's worked to have rescue and rehabilitation done. And all of us were happy when we got to know that the World Bank IMF meeting will still be held here, because initially we had a bit of a doubt whether the government would want to hold it here or not. But when you decided to have it here, and against all odds, it was such a wonderfully organized event with the signature hospitality of Morocco in full show. So thank you very much for that, and my expressed condolences on the tragedy that you had to face, but I'm sure you're coming out of it in a very steady and with good grit. We are in support. I think the Prime Minister of India did announce as soon as he heard about this that India would be happy to participate as and when Morocco finds it necessary and fit. So we stand by Morocco. But today we are assembled here in the context or the immediate background of the IMF and World Bank meeting, and also the last of the finance ministers and central bank governors meet under India's presidency. We were happy to have a communique come out. We were happy to have consensus on very many issues. And I was just standing here and talking with the organizers, with the CII, as to why it is so very important that we really take this consensus and consensus-driven communique issued in the G20 seriously. Many of what we want to talk today are going to be of great relevance for next couple of generations. May not be exactly comparable, but I would still place it. Post the Second World War, when the Bretton Woods institutions were established, the kind of consensus, coherence, cooperation with which the entire world looked at setting up of these institutions as a prerequisite for any revival post the war. And those institutions have stood by us for nearly 70, 80 years, but gradually now showing signs of fatigue. And because of that, many of the objectives which were to be served, other than restoring Europe after the war, are still waiting to be served. But many other institutions have come besides the Bretton Woods. But today we are at a juncture where post-COVID, post a very fragmented multipolar world, these very institutions now will have to be revived to meet with the current challenges, the challenges of 21st century, where if I were to confine myself talking only about the multilateral development banks, I can say that the best practices and the business model of the 19th century or 20th century was what governed the Bretton Woods institutions all the while. But today you see private banks or corporate sector itself going on a different business formulation and are lots more nimble in dealing with finances, raising resources, handling their objectives speedily and in a lot more efficient way. And therefore, India's presidency in the G20, before I say that, one other feature was most of the post-Second World War institutions, global institutions, were fashioned after most European powers or the United States of America, with very little, if I may say, very little contribution from countries which had just come out of colonial rule. So obviously Africa was not heard, Asia, many of them didn't have any say. But today's environment, the engine of growth actually lies with the emerging market economies, the developing economies. Resources which are so required for 21st century are all lying untapped in the African and Latin American continents. So now when you speak of the voice of the South, which is what Honorable Prime Minister of India did as soon as he took over the charge of G20 presidency, is to say that he shall make sure India's presidency will be the voice of the South. It's not just going to be India being part of the G20, but it shall reflect the aspirations and also the needs of the global South. Lucky that we had in the troika of the G20, Indonesia before us, and now Brazil after us. Post that, it's going to be South Africa. So you have a continuous 3-4 years with the emerging markets showing the leadership in the G20. So with all this, today for the CII, the panelists are certainly going to be talking on reviving growth with inclusivity. And for that, galvanizing private capital to support governments and multilateral institutions. Very much synchronizes with the recommendations of the international expert group, the co-chair, co-convener. N.K. Singh is with us here, so he is going to give you the rich content of what is in the IEG. But I'll go to talk about this theme, which has been talked and deliberated upon in the G20. The resilience of the global economy today is being tested in the face of multiple headwinds, which are amplifying the challenge of maintaining growth with inclusivity. However, as nations try to steer their respective economies and brace for an uncertain future, India stands out as a beacon of hope, resilience for the world. Amidst this backdrop, I am pleased to speak to you after the recently concluded G20 summit, where the world under India's historic presidency came together as one and unanimously adopted the Delhi Declaration. Inclusivity and consensus building have been a cornerstone of India's efforts during the presidency, reaffirmed across multiple domains. This approach is aptly captured in India's G20 theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which we have conveniently translated to mean one earth, one family, one future. These 3 words or 6 words actually bring in the theme of sustainability, inclusivity, climate, and taking care of everybody as though because we are part of one large family. So this is the vision of Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi. He articulated a human-centric approach to reshaping the global economy to be more prosperous, inclusive, and sustainable. Under his leadership, India made impressive strides in creating and leveraging its digital public infrastructure, about which there was a lot of discussion, for advancing financial inclusion and productivity gains. Key aspects of inclusivity and consensus building during India's G20 presidency included admitting the African Union as part of the G20, adoption of the Green Development Pact, commitment to pursue reforms for better, bigger, and more effective multilateral development banks, and convening the attention of member countries to the pressing needs of accelerating the progress of sustainable development goals. The theme of this inaugural session, meeting the SDG financing gaps, how can private capital support public funds, captures an important aspect of the broad recommendations that emanated from the Delhi Declaration regarding the timely pursuit of SDGs. As part of the Delhi Declaration, it was highlighted that at the midway point to 2030, the global progress of SDG is off track, with only close to 12% of the targets on track. Referring to this decade as the decade of action, India, under its presidency, has called upon the G20 members to collectively resolve to fully and effectively implement the 2030 agenda and accelerate progress towards the SDGs in a timely manner. It may be noted that 17 Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the United Nations, member states that is, have been extended to cover financing for SDGs in addition to climate finance. The COVID-19 pandemic widened the annual SDG financing gap in 2020 from an estimated $2.5 trillion to $3.9 trillion in just the developing countries. The challenge of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 is becoming increasingly difficult and is becoming increasingly difficult and is becoming more costly. Acknowledging this challenge under its presidency, India has sought new instruments for financing sustainable development goals. To bridge the SDG financing gap, especially for the emerging markets and developing economies, there is a need to enhance innovative financing approaches such as blended finance and risk-sharing tools which could be used to leverage private finance for scaling up sustainable finance. The B20 recommendations about which we had the President of the CII speak. The B20 recommendation for setting up of a global SDG acceleration fund, which proposes to bring governments, the private sector, and the philanthropies together to bridge the SDG financing gap by leveraging credit enhancement tools and blended finance, is along similar lines and could help bring down the cost of capital for enhancing the financial viability of SDG projects and pool of fundable projects. Private sector capital must complement the efforts of governments and multilateral institutions in pursuit of this global objective, and its contribution can go a long way in advancing the SDGs. Official sources of finance from the MDBs and other development finance institutions to reduce the real and perceived risks associated with projects in emerging markets and developing economies can help mitigate these risks and unlock significantly larger flows. In this endeavor, philanthropic capital can also play a similar role in absorbing risks and lowering costs, thereby helping to mobilize private capital. In 2023, we have focused on social-related SDGs such as health, education, poverty reduction, clean water and sanitation, and mapped them against financial instruments like social impact bonds, SDG-linked bonds, and so on. We have developed recommendations which aim to mobilize private financing for SDGs through greater adoption of these instruments and bonds. We have also compiled a compendium of case studies to build understanding and awareness among G20 members of the current actions being taken to enable financing towards SDGs. The compendium aims to share country experiences and best practices for financing SDGs. Working towards the advancement of SDGs is a global public good. I underline this. Working towards the advancement of SDGs is a global public good. The financing requirements are immense, which calls for a global collaborative effort across stakeholders. Efforts and concrete financing commitments of all, and official, when I say all, official governments, multilateral institutions, development finance institutions, and most importantly, the private sector. The efforts and concrete financing commitments of all is therefore very paramount, and these will have to complement each other for this shared global priority. In financing SDGs, private capital will do well to make sure that such investments are sustainable for countries too, and that means reconciliation of their commercial goals with the creation of public goods. This is a very important diagnostic tool. If you're able to understand that these investments are going towards country public infrastructure creation, then the balance between the commercial interest and the public interest gets worked out well. So in financing SDGs, private capital will do well to make sure that such investments are sustainable for countries too, and that means reconciliation of their commercial goals with the creation of public goods. The pursuit of SDG will have to be a sustainable endeavor in itself. Finally, I'm confident that the MDB's reform process itself, emanating from the G20 deliberations, will also provide a unique opportunity for them to maximize investments into developing countries, including through increased co-investments with the private sector, which can leverage this unique opportunity to increase its footprint in funding the SDGs and join hands with public institutions to meet the SDGs goal by 2030. To conclude, the SDGs provide a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity, for people and the planet, now and also into the future. It is the collective responsibility of all shareholders and for all stakeholders to participate in and contribute to this endeavor. I invite the private sector to come forward and join the pursuit of this global vision. Thank you for having me, and thank you for patiently hearing my thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Honorable Finance Minister, for that great keynote address, your vision, your talk about India's leadership at the G20 and how we at the private sector can work with the governments and how we can really globally come together on this very important issue of SDGs. Thanks for setting the context for this deliberations today, and your vision and your leadership would really help us in taking this discussion forward in a manner in which we can come back and report to you as to how we have been able to work together as a global community.
Well, thank you very much. At the outset, let me say that how profoundly grateful I am for this opportunity to participate in the Cii Roundtable immediately after the conclusion of the G20 summit. I'm grateful to you, Mr. Dinesh, to Mr. Banerjee, to have this roundtable on issues which are of significance to us in the foreseeable future. The Finance Minister's keynote address has outlined the main contours and the importance of the role of the private sector. I will not reiterate that, but I will just make a couple of points to say that we were privileged under the Indian presidency to work as in an independent expert group for the reforms of the multilateral development banks. We presented our report, the second report, day before yesterday, and the communique thereafter issued suggests that there is a wide measure of agreement and support for the broad agenda which you have outlined. That agenda, that brings me to the subject immediately, has three important attributes. First and foremost, we recognize that the financing needs, including the needs for sustainable development goals, are daunting. And for meeting these daunting goals, you require much larger sums of private capital than has been available in the past. That is why, in outlining the framework of our recommendations, we have suggested that as against just 60 billion, we have put a target of 240 billion. So the private sector has an exceedingly critical role to play. Second, what we have said, what has so far prevented the private sector to be mainstreamed? There's a big chapter in the Reform Committee's report on what can we do to harness private capital. Two or three things which I'll just mention top of the hand. Apart from hybrid capital, which the Honorable Minister has mentioned, apart from blended finance and innovative proposals, risk mitigation and lowering the risks and therefore being able to catalyze private flows has been one of our driving force. We have given several proposals, how to make greater use of guarantees on which tangible progress has yet to be made, how to minimize the risks of foreign exchange fluctuations on which tangible progress has yet to be made, how to bring about greater certainty on regulatory framework for which we have proposed as important part of an enhanced and a robust country platform. All these will lead re-engaging with the clients and re-engaging with the countries concerned if we are to meet the daunting ambition, which the minister mentioned, is quite significant. $3 trillion a year, $2 trillion from domestic sources, $1 trillion from concessional, non-concessional finance, of which $500 billion from the private capital alone, and the other $500 billion coming with a degree of effort. So private sector has an exceedingly important role to play. The minister mentioned about some of the proposals in the B20, which had set the broad framework, or some of these proposals and ideas. We can discuss that further. But just to assure you, Minister, that the MDB report, it has derived itself from a great deal of advice and consultation with you and your colleagues, looks not only to private sector, but seeks to really meet the daunting target of $3 trillion a year, $1 trillion coming from concessional and non-concessional finance. We will go into the granularity of this, Minister, but wanted to assure you that the points which you have mentioned have been reflected and have been significantly considered in the report which I had the privilege to chair, Coach.
Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. Thank you for being with us for the opening session and your address. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Singh, for again talking about your report. Again, we have had the privilege of interacting with you and your co-chair. And yes, there are a lot that we have to do from now from within the businesses of different countries and the governments to take that forward. I'll now request Mr. Hans-Peter Lankes, the visiting senior fellow of ODI, and of course, from the LSE and the Oxford International Growth Center to make his observations and his thoughts on this very important subject.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to join this distinguished panel and to say a few words, and I will do so in part as a member of the Secretariat that had the opportunity to work for Sri N.K. Singh and Larry Summers and the independent expert group in producing these reports, but also as an active and enthusiastic member of the Think 20 process that India launched at the beginning of the year and that I think was incredibly fruitful. So the question that I was being asked is, how do we improve private capital flows? How do we increase private capital flows for the SDGs and the climate goals? And it's useful to look back at the Addis Ababa Action Agenda of 2015 when the international community came together and I think for the first time really emphatically embraced the role of the private sector, of private finance, in achieving development goals. And that was a significant step in what was previously always considered to be a domain for the public sector, the development domain. Now, the reality since then, unfortunately, has not really lived up to the wishes and to the expectations. There has been a decline in net long-term private capital flows into emerging markets and developing countries by about 20% annually from 2013 to today. So not only did we not achieve that significant increase, that significant step up in these flows for Sustainable Development Goals and climate goals, we actually went backwards. We're beginning to better understand the causes and also possible solutions to this. We're also understanding the urgency of finding solutions. A big factor is, of course, our global financial conditions, the interest rate environment, which is not helpful here. Those are difficult challenges, but there are other challenges which we are more capable of addressing. And that is where I find the India Think 20 process has produced a lot of very useful material. It's useful to think about what our task here is as a shift in the architecture of international finance in order to better leverage private capital into development. And the India Think 20 distinguished between the need for volumes of finance to increase and the cost of capital, but also for the need to considerably grow the pipeline, let me call it, of investable projects. And it did so for the public sector, including the multilateral development banks, and for private sector flows. And let me highlight a few of the points that stick out. One is the role of the MDBs, and there our understanding that we can grow the MDBs from within with the capital they have. That is a point that has been clearly made by the Capital Adequacy Framework panel of the G20. We can use the MDBs to mobilize private capital by helping to de-risk investment opportunities and other means. We can also use the MDBs to catalyze private finance flows, and that is by creating the environments in which private capital can invest. There are other factors that were identified, for instance, the need to take a very deep look at the foreign exchange risks and whether we find mechanisms to address these. The importance of reviewing global financial regulation, which has a number of biases built in against long-term flows into developing countries, be it Basel III or the solvency regulations or the anti-money laundering regulations and others. Unwanted biases, and those need to be addressed. The need to address debt and the excess debt, the overhang of debt, and the impact that has on the cost of capital. So there are a variety of areas which we need to address in a comprehensive way in order to shift the global financial architecture to better leverage private capital flows. Let me take one and only one here to highlight, which we go into some depth in the independent expert group report, which we heard from N.K. Singh about, and that is the opportunity that the multilateral development banks have to better create the environment for private investments. And that is both internally in the way that multilateral development banks work, the World Bank Group, how it works together in its different parts, the IBRD, the IFC, the MIGA, and it is for the MDBs to work together across and as a system. And one should think that this is something fairly natural. One should think that it is natural that these institutions look at the downstream as a package together in an integrated way. Egypt has shown how this can be done very successfully with its energy sector. Colombia has shown how it can be done in the road sector in a very large manner. Turkey has shown how it can be done in the hospital sector. Those are the precedents on which we need to build, on which the multilateral development banks need to build to connect the public and the private, to connect the upstream work at sector level and the financing conditions at the investor level in order to be more effective going forward. With that, I will pass it back to you. With that, I will pass it back to you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and I'll now move to our last panelist and an expert, Mr. Donald Kaberuka, the former president of the African Development Bank and today the managing partner of the Southbridge Group. Your perspectives would also be very, very critical in the context of your experience and your understanding, please.
Thank you, and good morning. So I could agree with everything Hans-Peter has said, but I've just a couple more points I want to add. But before I do so, let me again congratulate India for a successful G20, the different initiatives taken, and in particular, the welcoming of the African Union as a full member of the G20. That was very much welcome. We keep talking about the need to reform international institutions, but I think having voice of all of us on the table is the most important reform. We all know that in the UN Security Council, for example, there is a pretension that it looks after the interests of the world. There's not a single African country, not a single one, I mean as a permanent member, not a single Arab country, not a single Latin American country, not India with 1.4 billion people. How can that represent the world? And so it is very important that even though maybe Africa is not as powerful economically as many others, but our voice on the table matters. So this was a major achievement which I want to commend you for. Number two, we're here talking about how to raise resources for SDGs, but there are also lessons to learn among ourselves. I mean, I was looking at the numbers here. I hope my Indian friends can correct me. What is it that we can learn from India, we as Africans? So I see that India's GDP between 1990 and now has multiplied 10 times. It was about 326 billion in 1990. Now it is close to 3.7 trillion, 10 times. And per capita growth, per capita GDP, from 375 to 2,400. In a country where the population, in the meantime, has increased from 870 million people to 1.4 billion people. That is a major achievement. I'm not saying that India is all paradise now. I know you have many problems, having been there recently. Not all the states have the same patterns, but there are some things we can learn from here. That's one point I wanted to emphasize. So this meeting is important, even from the viewpoint of learning from each other. Now, so when the SDGs were adopted in 2015, the world was slightly a different place, was it not? And a lot of things have happened since. We had, first of all, a new American administration, the Trump administration, immediately thereafter, which had other priorities, not necessarily SDGs. We have had COVID. We have had these crises in Eastern Europe. And all that had meant for priorities in global spending. If I pick, for example, the case of Europe, clearly now I think their emphasis is more on energy independence, increased defense spending, and in due course, I imagine the reconstruction of Ukraine and there's parts of Eastern Europe. So priorities have changed globally. So we have had a crisis, and then shifting priorities. And in the midst of this shifting crisis, but there are some mega trends which will not go away. And this is important for both India and us in Africa. And one of those mega trends is demographics. I think India and the rest of South Asia and Africa will be the demographic dynamics of the future. The median age in India, from what I've been told, is 28 years. 28 years. I think 40% of the people are below 30, I believe. Here in Africa, because those parts of our planet who have growth potential because of their age structure, all right, lack the capital needed to invest precisely to create growth in the future. So it is areas like India and South Asia and Africa which have the potential for growth in the future, which lack capital. And then you have countries in the global north, which, because of the aging societies, savings are increasing quickly, and the potential for obtaining the due returns to pay the pensions and the lack of it, outside narrow areas like technology and a few others, are quite limited. So you have a dilemma. Where there is capital, societies are aging, and the returns on investments are not as high, outside areas like new technologies. And those parts of the global south, which are young and have the potential for growth, lack savings. So this is the dilemma. Okay, so where is the opportunity? And what is the role of the international financial institutions? I think as someone has said, I think it was Larry Summers, I can't recall. Here really is the crux of what I think is the mother of all the reforms we need in the international financial institutions. Who is it that can intermediate this problem? In that, beyond those real risks, South Asia is very risky. It's just a perception. But a perception has a price. And that price is the high rate of borrowing, the premium which Africa pays, for example, when it goes to issue bonds in the markets. So we pay higher rates for real risks because there are very few institutions to pick up those risks. And we pay another premium for perception of the risks, which only we can deal with. So for me, we can reform the international institutions, more capital. I'm just saying bigger, bolder, and better. I agree with all that. But even if today you increase the capital of the World Bank 5, 6, 7 times, it will still be a small proportion of what is needed to fund the SDGs. And even if you did that, it will still be a small proportion of the resources available in these issues. You know, when discussions around what the new form the World Bank would take and so on, there was a fear in some places that maybe these institutions will now focus on the global public goods to the exclusion of the unfinished agenda of fighting poverty. I think now we have got clarity on that, thanks to the new president of the World Bank and others who have clearly articulated that these are the two sides of the same coin. You fail in one, you fail in the other. It is how you do national programming and adaptation, stuff like that, where you can address both the public goods and poverty. But it is still a small issue, is there not? And I will end on this by saying that I think it was the former Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, Sitharaman, who said that COVID exposed many things. It exposed the weakness of health systems, both in rich countries and poor countries, by the way. All right? But also exposed something else, which was the importance of social capital. In countries where social capital is high, where there was a lot of trust in societies, where there was growth that was inclusive, they were able to deal with COVID quite effectively. But in countries, even rich countries, where social capital was weak, they are very much unable to deal with COVID effectively, even when they had resources to do so. So this inclusion is not simple about that it is good for economic growth, for jobs and all this. It builds social capital we need to handle the crisis of the future, as again COVID demonstrated. So yes, we need to reform these institutions for voice, for representation, for being better prepared in the future. But we need them to be bold to take care of these changes in demography and what they mean in terms of what we can do together to fund the SDGs. So this is all I wanted today, and I thank you, sir.
So, can I, Donald, ask you the question from a panelist to a fellow panelist? Before Chandrajit Banerjee, who is moderating this, says there is only time left for 2 questions. But yes, I fully agree with you that where there is absorptive capacity, capital is not available. Where there is capital, absorptive capacity is not there. Demography does not automatically, given restrictions of governance and framework of that kind, enable the most efficient demographic management, which would improve the overall productivity of the global economy. So one of the areas where you have worked greatly as an important institution, believe that exactly for the reason that Donald, which you have mentioned, that if you cannot have the most efficient mechanism, then pragmatism would suggest then at least you have a mechanism, which is the family of multilateral development banks as a whole, which currently is only able to harness 120 billion a year, which you know. So if our agenda, which has now been endorsed by the G20 yesterday in a communique, is to take that from 120 billion to close to 400 billion, that is a quantum change. And the power of 400 billion, if the example of the systems are that the one unique point about multilateral development banks is its efficient intermediation of capital. So if you can leverage 400 billion at least into 5 times, it does begin to make some difference in terms of the overall scenario. I totally agree with you that some of the fundamental divides would remain, but a beginning has to be made somewhere, and that is what our modest effort has been. And Sitharaman has been a member of my committee. He's been generous enough to sign the report even as the president of Singapore, and that is really, but he has been a key player. He was indeed the first one to have done this under the German presidency, to have given the independent expert group. So we are on the same page, except to say that at least the G20 has begun now a credible effort in being able to look and harness the latent potential of this family.
So using Morocco as a shining example of Africa, and following on from what you've just said, and knowing that this is probably your 3rd or 4th visit to Morocco, could you give your impressions of how far you think Morocco has come in terms of achieving the UN SDG goals, and where the wins, where we can do better? We would love to know from you.
Oh, that is a tough question, Preeti. But let me tell you that Morocco has provided enlightened economic decision making. It has a huge untapped potential in opportunity. And each trip that I have made here, I find more and more credible progress. And I think that the credible progress in terms of girl-child education, in terms of critical health parameters, in terms of improved quality of infrastructure, and I think that it has this great potential to be a bridge between Europe and Africa. And I think that that's a potential which is waiting to happen. Anyone else?
One more, yeah. From the audience, or a cross question between our panel. Would you? Yeah, please.
Edward Christoph, United Nations Development Programme. Is there a role for the social enterprise in reviving growth and inclusivity? And here I think we talk about human development, which is durable, sustainable. Thank you.
Well, I think that the United Nations has taken a credible lead in this. The recently convened summit of the Secretary General of the United Nations in the first week of this session of the UN General Assembly, to which I was invited, but regrettably I was a little preoccupied. And I think that yesterday the discussions which I had with the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations reinforces my belief that the UN has an important catalytic role to play, a great role in being able to bridge together approaches and diversities across regions and across continents, and enhance the degree of awareness on the unrealized SDG goals. And I think in being able to harness finance and finance's potential across different regions and different parts of the world. By the way, the contribution of inputs which we received from the Secretary General of the United Nations and the UN family has been an important input in enabling us to evolve a program which we hope can suitably also redress or address this issue, which I think is still waiting to happen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone, all of you in this hall who participated in this session, and all our panelists, all the three very expert panelists who gave their inputs and really now would help us in creating this coalition, if I can say, between the private sectors across the world and also working with other groups, the think tanks, the other social enterprises, as you mentioned, the governments especially, as we take forward some of the very important notes that we have from this session. Ladies and gentlemen, as you wait for the next session, may I thank you once again for your very warm participation.
मैंने थोड़ा चेंज कर दिया
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to start the next session. May I request all of you to take your seats, please? Excuse me.
May I request all the panelists to please take their seats on the dais. Ladies and gentlemen, please settle down. Please kindly take your seats. We are starting the next session. Please take your seats. We have a very, very high-profile panel, an expert panel for the second session. Kindly take your seats. Thank you. Can one of my colleagues shut the door, please? Please.
Get people back.
Yeah.
So shall we? Shall we start? Okay. Okay. So we'll start. So welcome. Welcome to you all back to the last session, which is on reviving global growth with inclusivity. We have basically slightly more than an hour, so we make sure, I'll make sure we respect the time. So let us start straight away with Mr. Ajit Pai, partner. We start with you. You have a presentation.
Properly. Are you asking me to start?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Very good evening and thank you very much. And thanks to CII for inviting me here to share my thoughts. I think reviving growth with inclusivity is a very important idea to think about. Let me share my thoughts by drawing on the Indian experience. Having had the privilege to be part of the team that conceptualized and implemented India's economic policy during COVID as the chief economic advisor, I am happy to share the perspective on how we went about thinking, about growth and inclusivity. So the case I want to make is for good policy and policy that is thought from first principles and that is quite paramount for inclusive growth in the global economy. So I want you to rewind back to March, April of 2020 when the pandemic was raging, and we in India I was for a while, for at least a couple of weeks, trying to think, what does this crisis really mean? During our PhD program, I had the privilege of doing my PhD at the University of Chicago, all of us were taught that every crisis is a demand-side shock. That is something that we knew very well. But at the same time, I remember trying to sort of agonizingly thinking about that this has to be more. Because unlike the Latin American crisis or the Asian financial crisis or the global financial crisis, in this instance, governments were asking their citizens to stay at home. So of course, apart from an impact on earnings, there had to be something more, to the crisis. And that is one thing, I think that, if you will, the sort of the doubt about the diagnosis of the crisis, I think, in hindsight helped a lot, because that made me go and read a lot. And within a couple of weeks, I came to the conclusion that this crisis is not only going to be a huge demand-side shock, it's going to be a big supply-side shock as well. And the reason it's going to be a supply-side shock is that, production will suffer when employees are asked to stay back home. Not just that, the supply chain will get disrupted, because some firms in the supply chain obviously, might go into distress, some might go belly up as well. And it is this identification, this diagnosis of the crisis as both a supply and a demand-side shock, which is what then led India to actually implement, an economic policy during COVID that was a very judicious mix of both. See the infrastructure, and we would go and find that we don't have that kind of infrastructure in India. So that was one of the key aspects of the supply side push. A second key aspect was recognizing that private sector firms, production by the private sector firms, is an incredible important part of supply, and therefore the production-linked incentives were actually initiated as part of the of the supply side measure. There were other measures as well, but for want of time, I'm not going to go in detail. But let me also come to the demand side measures. And here as well, I think it was very important to conceptualize very carefully how to make sure that the bang for the buck of the taxpayer money was maximized. I'll give you an example. For an instance where this was not maximized. if you take the United States, United States gave $5,000 checks to everyone. My daughter, who was studying at the University of Chicago at that time, many of her friends got $5,000 checks. I'm sure all of you recognize here that, kids studying in a private university are actually not ones that necessarily need that $5,000 check. And yet it was actually spending across the board. In contrast, in India, we use the financial sector, and Mr. Khera is here, he and his other counterparts in the financial sector did a fabulous job by overlaying guarantees. So two key aspects that were on the demand side measures was lending by banks to small and medium enterprises. They did a lot of lending to small and medium enterprises, but with a guarantee that was overlaid, first loss guarantee overlaid by the Indian government. Secondly, to take care of the urban poor who were most impacted during the pandemic, we also used on lending by the microfinance institutions, again overlaid with a guarantee. And I want to spend a couple of minutes explaining to you why this conceptualization was very important. As an economist, I'm always actually aware of the problems of adverse selection and moral hazard that inflicts financial markets. Because of that, what happens, and that's one way to think about it, but another way also is, during a crisis, households face two key risks. They face liquidity risks because they are short of earnings, they don't have as much money immediately, and they also face credit risks. Normally, without a guarantee, the financial sector would be more than happy to lend to people like us, who are basically who even at that time during the pandemic, were neither facing a liquidity risk nor a credit risk. They would be very wary of lending to people who are either facing a credit risk or a liquidity risk or both. And this is where the guarantee came in to actually convert what is usually adverse selection in financial markets into favorable selection, because people like us, we don't need the money, we don't need the loan, but those who are suffering either a liquidity risk or a credit risk or both are the ones that would basically go and borrow. And importantly here, using the financial sector was crucial, because we all know very well, if I have the ability to repay a loan when it comes for repayment, and I do not repay, then my credit score gets impacted. Therefore, by using the financial sector, we use the incentives of borrowers to pay for themselves, those who are in a situation. I'll just finish up in a minute. Those who are in a situation, because it's very important for countries to understand that for them to repay. So as a result, those that are facing credit and liquidity risks will not be in a situation to repay. For them, the guarantee ends up becoming quasi-cash transfer. Yet those that actually do not face liquidity risks, do not face credit risk, for them they repay. And by doing that, we were able to target the demand side measures very carefully to those that needed them. And therefore this judicious mix of supply and demand side measures is what has led to inclusive growth in the Indian economy. And as you can see, the data speaks for itself. Macro fundamentals are very strong. Growth at 7.2% this year and expected to be 6.5% compared to the previous crisis, global financial crisis, when India was part of the Fragile Five. So I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and it is good policy that is thought from first principles that is absolutely important for inclusive growth. Thank you.
Thank you. So your point is well made. The combination of good structural policies and macro stability combined with innovation in the financial sector. Please, let's welcome Mr. Ajit Pai for a brief presentation. Sorry, you were not on the panel, so I couldn't realize. So please, let's make this 5-6 minutes so we can engage the room. If we have time, there are many speakers. Thank you.
Certainly.
Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone, and I just wanted to thank you for the privilege of being able to share with you the work done by the task force for the B20 on financing for global economic recovery. So what I'm going to try and do, since we have 6 minutes, we had prepared for about maybe 15, is rush you through as quickly as possible to give you the factors that we were considering in this particular task force. What we're going to do is we'll skip through the people involved. All I can say is that it was a very international group of people, some of the top financial institutions in the world. We had 150 members, approximately, 7 co-chairs, and I'm also happy to say that the developed world and the developing world thought on the same lines when it came to the recommendations of the task force. And the primary recommendations have made it to the actual B20 communique, and were talked about in the earlier panel as well, which is the GSAF, which I'll give you some color as to the genesis of that GSAF. But basically, when we looked at the global financial recovery, and we looked at reaccelerating sustainable global growth, we also looked at the trajectory of growth since the 1960s, which was a decelerating trajectory. And we'll have a look at it again. For those in the morning session, I apologize for only 1 or 2 slides that are repeated. Then we're going to look at shifting. Most central banks around the world have looked at whenever there's a slowdown in the economies, they look at giving an interest rate boost to boost consumption in the short run. So we're going to look at this stage, where the debt in the world being as high as it is, we're going to be looking at shifting from looking at consumption to investments. And that was one of the things that the group really talked about and felt that there is a need for great investment, especially that's where SDGs came in. Then we looked at the financing for the global economic recovery. We said it's much better if it's more sustainable, because disparity was increasing in the world, including in the developed countries. And then we said that one of the biggest needs, rather than find a new need, we said let's look at a need that is already defined. So the SDG 230 goals are already defined. Countries had made commitments, and very clearly the financing for meeting those commitments was not there. Most countries, you heard in the earlier session, most countries collectively were behind, far behind, 12%, or a fraction of where they needed to be at this stage. So we said that should be something that the group can focus on, existing initiatives that we can enhance. And then we looked at, okay, even if the money is there, do we really have the capacity to execute if you just double the money? So we said there's lots of capacity issues within the overall framework that were an issue. So we said that's something that we need to sort out with our solutions. And then after that, we said that the capital that is available right now may not be sufficient for what the world requires, and we'll go through some of those numbers very quickly. So what we might want is an SDG acceleration fund, and we'll talk about this fund a little bit more, because its structure, the proposed structure, is very different from the way the multilateral development banks function, although we have recommended that this fund be housed in either an MDF or a similar organization. So this is the trajectory of global economic growth decelerating from the 1960s, from the 6% range back then to 3% now. Everything you've heard from the IMF and the World Bank aren't particularly optimistic about things getting much better anytime soon. But there is a divide here, and especially in Morocco, and when the conversation going on about the North and the South, the OECD is expected to be much below that 3%, and some of the developing economies are likely to be above that. It's just that the developing economies are a much smaller percentage of the overall world, so it'll take some time for that offset to happen. We then talked about debt. So if the world has already got too much debt, it's going to be a bit challenging for us to be able to get that debt, increase that debt. And so we have to be extremely strategic about where that debt goes. So this is total debt to GDP for the world. And we have to see when sustainability and debt servicing is an issue, we have to see where the extra debt should go so that the world's GDP can grow faster. You get the greatest bang for buck for that additional debt. Here we're just showing you the progress on the SDGs across geographies everywhere. You can see we are far behind where we need to be. I won't waste more time here. You've probably spent a lot of time in the past couple of days looking at this. But what the Honorable Finance Minister of India referred to earlier today, which is the gap between the investments that are happening and the investments that were required, and this is for 2019, before COVID. And there's already a $2.5 trillion gap between the demand and supply. And once you had COVID, you had additional spending from central governments on things that were not related to the SDGs, because emergency response, and you had a drop in revenue. So you had economic activity slow down sharply. So that gap, with the less time remaining to 2030, that gap actually exploded to somewhere between 4 and 5 trillion on an annual basis until 2030. So very clearly the needs of the world were not going to be met using any existing institutions. There was a second or third factor that came into play over here, which is when we looked at the SDG goals, and this is a Brookings study that was done, we found that the vast majority of the capital that needed to be spent for attaining those SDGs was actually not in the developing world. It was in the developed world, the vast majority. So one of the reasons why we have suggested that we have a unique structure, maybe housed in a multilateral development bank, but a unique structure for this fund, is that the way the MDFs are structured, the capital comes from across the world, but most of the loans are to the developing world. So they're like development banks on the poverty and the basic development, not so geared towards climate. So the biggest needs are for the higher income countries and the middle income countries rather than developing countries. But there's one other issue, which is if you have a look at who the biggest carbon polluters are today. If you're not talking about history, we're not talking about the Industrial Revolution, we are talking about today in 2023, you'll find that the developed countries on a per capita basis, the higher the per capita GDP, significantly higher the carbon footprint of that country. So in trying to get things to fully recover, we know that the spending and actual amounts would be much greater in the developed countries and on a per capita basis as well. So these are the kind of things that we looked at to actually come up with what our recommendations would be. And I'll give you some color as to what those recommendations are. The first recommendation that we came up with was for the Global SDG Acceleration Fund for financing of global public goods, but with an initial focus on what I will call geographically fungible global public goods. Now, how do we define geographically fungible? The traditional model, which we talked about for the SDGs, when you look at healthcare, you look at education, you look at a lot of those things. A number of countries, even if they're developed with very high debt that are struggling, they don't think that that is the highest priority in a developing country to spend that money. Might not be for them. So there will be debate back and forth. We have seen far-right governments come in many countries. But the moment you get into something where it doesn't matter, it is the experience, the impact is going to be global. Does someone in Germany care whether those 1,000 tons of carbon are released in Germany or elsewhere? Not really. So what they really want is to bring down certain things that are geographically fungible. And 4 of these geographically fungible global public goods, one is climate change, one is energy transition, another is ocean pollution. Doesn't matter where it comes from, which river, which country, it eventually lands up in the ocean and is doing a lot of damage, and the other is biodiversity. So to begin with, this fund would be focused on these and trying to go with the credit enhancement model, which is something that we'll talk about later. The second, third, and fourth, I won't spend much time on. The second was capacity building, which is across many things, how to get the projects better, de-risk them, all of that, which is very important as well, was discussed in the previous session. And then the recommendation 3, which is MSMEs access. They are the bulk of the economy, figuring out they're fragile, definitely more fragile than large corporates that are more diversified, how to help them through so there's not much scarring. And then, of course, recommendation 4 is sustainable and resilient infrastructure. So this is the focus, I think, of what they wanted me to speak on today, which is the Global SDG Acceleration Fund. The main goal was, with the widening of the credit gap, that you wanted a fund that would help cover that. Because the ratio and leverage should have been the greatest possible, we decided to use it purely as a credit enhancement fund to bring down the cost of capital rather than use it for other purposes, to use completely leverage private capital from the outside for this fund. So one of the interesting things that you might have observed in the world that we found fascinating was that just before COVID, there's a country that raised a 100-year debt at a lower cost of capital than India is able to raise 10-year debt. And that country had defaulted 3 times in the prior 15 years on its debt, sovereign debt. So the reason for that, and I think it would resonate with the Global South, is that the single largest criteria for the debt rating agencies, the S&Ps, the Moody's of the world, and the Fitches, is per capita GDP. So if you have a low per capita GDP, the credit rating agencies believe that the ability to pay also is the intention to pay. So a country that has defaulted was able to do that multiple times. So what we said is cost of capital is such a big factor that is a huge global inefficiency right now that for any globally fungible, geographically fungible global public good, we want to ensure that that same kind of project anywhere in the world, if it's helping the world in a similar way, that it should be able to get cost of capital that is comparable. And that will actually increase the number of projects that will become eligible, that will become viable. When you bring down 18% to 5%, I do have examples. We won't have time to show that, I think the constraints of time. But you can see that the number of projects that become viable in developing countries almost doubles. So that amount of projects that can, sort of work doubles. The second is you reduce the risk of these projects very significantly. The moment you sort out some of these issues around these projects. And if you incentivize it by ensuring that the check boxes, the business plans, the agreements, all of that are much higher quality in the scoring mechanism for prioritizing these projects, you're also de-risking the money that you're putting in. So both perceived risks as well as real risks mitigation was very high up on the agenda in designing this Global SDG Acceleration Fund. And then we looked at, where would you, sort of put this fund, and we said that the structure today of the MDFs is not the appropriate one because it's primarily directed towards developing economies, but global capacity today of understanding how you fund these infrastructure projects, all of that is the highest within the multilateral development banks. But the way the balance sheet of the MDFs are structured, and we'll have a quick look at that, is actually on the basis of the developing, there's an equal contribution, but most of the money goes only to the developing countries. So that would need to change, just given the fact that a lot of the climate factors are elsewhere. So we have a proposed structure here. This is the proposed contributions. So you can see it's a function of the GDP per capita and the GDP. So the numbers would vary quite differently from the way the world structures now that we look at shortly. But a $100 billion fund is what he took over there. The second, I think, very powerful suggestion from the B20 was the B20 is, of course, a non-government organization. It's the sort of, like CII was the secretariat in India, but it's basically the businesses of the different countries. It's a engagement group rather than a working group. But they volunteered to say that if we take just 0.2% of the corporate profits of the largest companies of the top 30 countries, that will be enough over a 3-year period. You don't need it up front because the financing will take time. That will be enough to close this gap of what the amount that is required for this fund to be fully funded at the 3-year mark. So this resulted in, like today in India, over the past maybe more than a decade now, corporates in India give 2% of their corporate profits for what they call CSR, for corporate social responsibility. So it's an experiment that has worked in India. It's been fairly effective. Very few corporates.
Is it?
Yeah.
Maybe it's interesting. Is it earmarked to specific expenditures, or it goes in the budget?
So the corporate has the option to spend it itself.
Okay.
And if it does not want to spend that money doesn't disappear. It has to go to 2 or 3 earmarked funds at the national level. So there are funds that are there at the national level that will go by default. But otherwise, the company has the option to spend it itself in certain categories, and these categories are very well documented. But what we are asking for now is only 0.2%, but it's also not just India. We're asking for the top 30 economies to contribute. And the math appeared to work out to a way that we could actually bring it down, and the same corporations will benefit a lot, because if you remove uncertainty, you remove risk, and you de-risk, and we want greater private sector participation in the funding of this entire SDG, towards the SDGs, we thought it would happen much faster. So why it should be probably under the World Bank Group is a pitch that we had made at the B20, and we felt that just the capacity to do this, to build a new institution, will be very difficult, but it can structurally be separate, because the balance sheet of this as a fund would be different from the World Bank's overall balance sheet. And this is where you'd see what it would look like in terms of what the current share of the World Bank is in terms of subscription of the IBRD and voting power. and then what, of course, the GSAF would look like. So very different, and it's very different because the beneficiary is very different. The biggest beneficiary is actually the developed world for these projects, and we don't care where the project is in the world, if it's helping with carbon to the same extent, if it's helping with energy transition to the same extent. Why should it have double or triple the cost of capital in a developing economy? It didn't make sense because the whole world would benefit equally.
Thank you.
So I think I'll stop over there. Can go through the structure, but I think it gives enough room for us to understand and appreciate some of the factors that this task force dealt with. It was indeed really delightful to see this work referred to by a number of the other engagement groups and working groups. And of course, thank you all for giving me the privilege.
Thank you, Mr. Ash. Thank you. The point is very clear. There's money. It's not much at the global level. Good policies as well. The idea of earmarking within countries expenditures under the corporate social responsibility is interesting. Maybe we will have questions on that. Madam Nazha Hayat, please. SDG private capital, as you're the regulator for the capital markets in Morocco. How do you see the contribution of private flows, capital flows, private investment, sorry, in helping achieving these SDGs? Thank you.
This is better. Thank you. First, I wanted to thank CII for its invitation to this panel and giving me the chance to explain what we have been doing in order to enhance the role of capital markets to finance, not only to contribute to the financing of the economy, but also to meet the SDGs in Morocco. So as Karim we pointed out, I had the Capital Market Authority in Morocco, which is equivalent of your SEBI in India, and we have a stock exchange, capital markets, that will have its 95th anniversary next year. So all tradition of capital markets, but very limited to institutional investors and to high net worth individual and large corporate. This is until the profound reform took place 30 years ago. As a regulator today, my mandate is not only to oversight the market, to ensure the investors' protection, but also to have a clear framework to enable the development of this market in order for the companies to find innovative, diversified solutions for finance in a country that is still a bank-based financing country. So our journey with the way we have tackled the financing need for sustainable projects is the same that the one we have followed to develop our capital markets. We started first by asking ourselves, what markets do we want for our country, and why isn't our markets financing all kinds of projects? Which is so we decided to have an evolving regulation that would focus on the corporate needs, but also on the the capacity to attract domestic, local, and also foreign investors. This is how we, on sustainability, we started first with climate, with the needs to finance green projects, and during COP22, we were able, in order to tackle urgent needs for green projects, we developed an approach with starting with very comprehensive guidances to explain what could be a green project, what are the requirements in terms of transparency, of information, of independent evaluation, and once we did that, we could enable our first guidances were published with the support of IFC. IFC had that ability to give us the benchmark of the international recognized standards, and after that it enabled a certain number of projects to be financed. The first one was 2 solar plants in Ouarzazate for Mazen, the Moroccan Sustainable Agency, and after that we included in our regulation a certain number of requirements, like for instance today the ESG report, which is mandatory since 2019, which was really something very unique in a developing market. So this is one example. Another example of sustainability is how can the market finance SMEs, not only large corporate or public, big public projects. So with the stock exchange, we created a condition of what is called an alternative market dedicated to SMEs, where we have been able to have maybe lighter conditions to come to the market, but also with the balance of investor protection. At the same time, one of our challenges also to meet the SDGs goals and an economy and a growth where no one should be left behind, we also worked for some time with Ministry of Finance, but also Central Bank, to have a clear and a clear framework and a legal regulating framework for crowdfunding. Now we are ready. We are ready to license the new crowdfunding platforms, and we want this new this new instrument to be as inclusive as possible. And for us, it's a challenge, because, like all challenges, when we have to tackle innovation and risk related to this innovation and the fintech as a whole, more globally. Have I answered your question, Dr.
Thank
Inel?
you. Let's turn now to Madame Onzorg. She's Chief Economist of the South Asia region at the World Bank. Question about infrastructure financing, which is a long-term finance, and Indian companies have been very active in this sector. How can we make sure that we have the appropriate financial structure to finance this kind of investments? There have been several experiments in the area of public-private partnerships. There are also, of course, concessional money. What's your take? They're part of the SDGs, of course. They are an important component. So what would you take from the experience in the region where you work today, or any other experiences that would be useful to share here? Thank you.
Thank you. Infrastructure is a critical issue. It is the thing that connects people with markets and people with inputs. It is really the accelerator to development. And it is fundamentally something that creates externalities. So but there is a role of the government to provide it. The problem is that often the private sector is much better at running things than the government. So this is the place where you really need this collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. And there are two parts to this. One is simply the pot of money, the size of the pot of money. The other part of it is how that pot of money is spent. So on the pot of money that's available, I mean, a lot of people are active in this space. No? And the World Bank has a large infrastructure program and finances a lot of the infrastructure in our region as well and elsewhere. And Ajay Banga just announced, the president just announced that we have leveraged our balance sheet. There's another 40 billion lending capacity in the next 10 years. And if we do hybrid capital and guarantees, there'll be another $157 billion in lending capacity over the next decade. So there is clearly a push on the multilateral development banks to expand the pot of money that's available for development, including infrastructure. And then it is good to see these private initiatives, like, for example, the Sustainable Acceleration Fund. Presumably, some of it also goes into infrastructure, the resilient type of infrastructure, and that allows a reduction in emissions as well. The second part of this is the use of these funds, the operation of this infrastructure, to make sure that it runs, that maintenance is done, that it's efficiently built. That's really where there is very little alternative to the private sector. This is where the private sector is absolutely critical. And we see that in most of the large infrastructure projects. This is where the private sector has perhaps the biggest role to play, just making sure it's well done, well run, even a decade later, it functions. And there the World Bank helps, but this is where the private sector plays a very big role. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's turn now to Mehdi Tazi. He's an entrepreneur. He's particularly in the insurance sector in Morocco, but he's also in the Moroccan Confederation of Enterprises. Can you tell us this very important reform that Morocco has undertaken on the generalization of social protection, and how do you see this, and particularly the whole of the private sector, including actually insurance companies, which play an important role already in this sector?
Well, thank you for having me. First, I would like to thank the CII, the Indian private sector, for having CGM part of this event. We've prepared it with our friends, and I think it's a success, so thank you for that. One thought that I would like to share before answering your question, in this SDG development and growth, I see one paradox that I'm not seeing anyone answering it. So it's a thought, but at the same time, it's a question to everyone involved here. The growth of population worldwide, we are, I think, 8 billion today. We're supposed to be 11 billion in 20 years. We all know that there is no growth with an aging population. And we also know that there is no sustainability with a growing population at some point, because we cannot be 50 billion at some point on the planet. So it will be too big at some point. And this parameter of how many we are and how we grow is not something that is taken into account, and I think it should be one parameter in the equation. Coming back to your question, part of the inclusivity is to having a social protection to any citizen within the country. In Morocco, until today, we had, out of a population of, let's say, 36 million people, we have a working workforce of, let's say, 11 million in that work, out of which 4 million were insured. So 4 million plus their families. So let's say 12 million out of 36 million. One important, the Royal project was to generalize the social protection. It's under process through the National Social Security Agency. We are today at around 25 million people insured. So we moved from, let's say, 12 million to 25 million in a year and a half. This project is supposed to be finished in 1 year, so we'll have close to 100% of the population insured, and I think it's a very important step toward inclusivity through the social protection.
Thank you. Let's turn now to Mr. Dinesh Kara, you're chairman of the State Bank of India. I wanted to take you a little bit on technology and access to lending to you know, in remote areas and to the poorest segment of population. In India, technology has played an important role, and you've been very smart in cash transfers using technology, cards, mobile phones. What's your you know, the lessons you draw for, of course, your country, but more generally for the South in general? And how can we finance, what's the role of the financial sector as well? And also, how do you reach out to the poorest of the poor, which are not necessarily have the literacy to manage this kind of products?
Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity on a subject which is perhaps touching the lives of many, and is a very, very critical component when it comes to the SDG. I think when it comes to the inclusivity, perhaps the role which is played in terms of reaching out to the millions and billions is something which cannot be overemphasized. Having said that, we in India, we have got a situation where, one, the geography is very vast. Secondly, we had a situation where, in terms of the bank accounts, it was not there with all. So way back in 2014, we started a massive action in terms of which we call it a jam. And today, the balance which stands into these accounts is almost $30 billion. So it has actually helped in terms of financialization and formalization of the economy. By virtue of having these accounts in place, we are now in a position to offer the digital lending, which is few-click lending, just about 4 clicks, and the money can get transferred into the beneficiary accounts. When it comes to sourcing applications, there are platforms available, and also we're in a position to offer the in-principle sanction in just about 59 minutes. So that is something which has gone a long way in terms of building the confidence of the SME population, and also a very sizable population which was deprived of the credit facilities. So I think from the inclusivity point of view, this has gone a long way. It has helped in terms of ensuring that all the entitlements goes frictionless to the beneficiary's account, and also their confidence into the welfare schemes of the government have really got enhanced. So I think this is a major gain for an economy like India. Now, when we talk about the kind of gap which is there when it comes to the global warming, which is perhaps impacting the whole. I'm happy to share with all of you that what was referred in terms of the 2% in terms of the corporate social responsibility spending by the corporates, it's a big corpus which actually gets created. The only thing is that unless and until we have got a structured way in terms of how it should be used, we probably cannot have the measurable impact, or the impact assessment is very, very important for achieving these focus goals in terms of the global warming, in terms of the SDGs, etc., etc. So I would very strongly advocate that there is a need for having a structured system in terms of capturing these important details and also reproducing them. Happy to share that in India, the Securities and Exchange Board of India, which is the capital market regulator, have mandated to all the listed companies that they must come out with their report wherein they will capture what all they are doing in terms of achieving the SDGs. So it becomes part of the focus for the investors. It becomes part of the focus for the regulators. I think it's effort wherein perhaps everybody needs to contribute in terms of standardizing the processes and also in terms of having the regulations which encourage and nudge the corporates and individuals to move in a given direction. Thank you.
So let's turn to, we're getting close to the end. Let's turn to you. If there's any comment, questions, clarifications.
Can I just add a point, couple of points to...
Couple is too much? Just 2 points?
1 point. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the presentation that Ajit made, and now I'm, wearing my IMF hat and speaking on, I think the point about the credit ratings is a good one. What one needs to recognize is that the model that credit rating agencies used for coming up with sovereign credit ratings is an empirical model, and I speak as a financial economist. When we think about any credit rating, it is essentially nothing but a mapping onto the probability of default. And that is a function of the overall GDP of the country, because that is what then enables you to pay the overall debt of the country, not GDP per capita. And also about so it's the ability to repay and the willingness to repay. The current credit rating model actually is not working because despite the many of the high per capita GDP countries defaulting after the global financial crisis, what the rating agencies have tried to do is just tweak a model that is conceptually incorrect and work on this to be able to bring these aspects, will really help in reducing what economists would call market failure, so that those countries that really need the financing and the investment, on many of these public goods that Ajit rightly pointed out, those can actually get, and just making sure that the pressure on the sovereign credit rating agencies for them to think about the model conceptually and coming up with a model will enable really in reducing this market failure. Thanks.
Thank you. By the way, at the Policy Center for the New South, we have contributed 4 papers within the Indian G20 engagement group with think tanks, with our friends at the Observer Research Foundation, so on several of these topics. So everybody's tired? Many interesting experiences, come on. Well, I'm gonna pick someone, huh? Voilà, allez-y, young lady. You introduce yourself shortly. Stand up so everybody sees you. Voilà.
Can you hear me?
Trust the mic. It should have been on.
I trust the mic. So I'm Hiteshi. I'm an Indian. I'm working in Morocco, working with the Multilateral Fund Institute, which invests in infrastructure in Africa. And I was really inspired and happy to hear the GSAF model because this is something that we are trying to do in Africa. Yet I was surprised, and I point the question to Mr. Ajit or anyone who wants to answer, that when you say that you would be giving the same cost of capital to infrastructure projects globally, how would you account for the additional risk that comes with not investing in projects which are not in hard currency? There is always a risk of currency. If you're investing in a project which is being made maybe in Nigeria and things are getting more and more expensive, it creates an additional risk. How do you equate that and account for that in your model so that your investors, the donors, the funds, they are also happy and yet you made the capital and credit accessible for them? Thank you.
Yeah, you better make your investor
If you permit,
happy.
I would like to answer that question.
Wait, I'm gathering questions, because otherwise they come back to sleep, they relax. Italy, question. Austed, Auma. لا لا حدك هاو
Africa example. I have got a lot of experience with the African world, especially in the field of infrastructure, in the field of the BRT, in the field of the different problems. Many a time, many countries in Africa are facing problems. Like Ghana today, they have a lot of defaults happening. The private sectors are not able to do business over there. Same thing is in Nigeria. You have the same problems happening. Now, I'm giving you just two important examples, but there are many more in these countries. Like Zambia, for example, they have a big debt issues on this matter. How do you think that the private and public sector, or public or private sector, can work together? Because we have a lot of business opportunities we have done in Ivory Coast, we have done in Senegal, we have done in Ghana, we have done in Uganda, Kenya, many countries. Still, they are very happy with our track record because World Bank and our group has been working for many years, and there is a big track record of our past experience. For example, which we did a project in Nigeria, BRT. They told us we want to do more BRTs with your group. We want to finance, we want to do everything or the other. But the point is, World Bank and IMF can join hands together with private-public partnership. You don't have to work only with Hinduja Group. You have many other companies in India, many other companies in Morocco, many other companies in Turkey, France, many other places, so that you can create to solve problems. Like a doctor diagnoses the patient. You are like a doctor. Wherever problems are there, you should try to take, a circle of a group of business people with the private sectors. They can be able to come up with some ideas. So how would you able to contribute that angle on this?
Your point is very clear. Are you invested in Morocco too?
Oh yes, of course.
Okay.
We have invested in Morocco. We are in 50 countries. We have 200,000 people working in our family, in our group. And all public sectors are working in different areas. The biggest banking operations, we have got a good track record, which you can verify and you can find out about us.
Thank you very much. That's actually one of the topics that has come back to these annual meetings, how we can crowding. Guys, when they give you the mic, it's on. Don't touch the button.
Hello, my name is Avijit, and I run a fintech startup from Casa Finance City. I have a question on the subject, reviving growth on inclusivity on the Moroccan market. So my question is to Karim and Mehdi both, that if many of the Moroccan MSMEs are not digitally included in the financial system, how would you plan to revive their growth or incentivize them in future?
Small and medium-sized enterprises. Yeah, that's a question for Madame Nasha as well. No? Financing of SMEs. Okay. When they're not sort of including in the banking sector. So let's stop here. Who wants to pick? There was a very interesting question here. The one on SMEs, the one on the BRICS.
This market failure, and maybe creating some intermediary that has and capital can be actually provided, which creates markets for hedges, that are long enough maturities. That will really enable, and what happens is because of the absence of this market, the risk that is perceived is disproportionate. Will you allow my expertise to actually take care of itself? I will answer the questions. I understood the question very well.
But out of courtesy,
I understand.
Out of courtesy.
Mr. Kera said, the digital public infrastructure, I think sovereign creating that digital public infrastructure is really important. For want of time, I will just say that when private sector creates it, oftentimes the price that is charged for the digital public infrastructure is not at a level where people at the bottom of the pyramid can afford it. But when the sovereign creates it, the pricing is such that it enables universal access and thereby inclusive growth. That's a short answer. We can have actually a longer discussion later.
Thank you. One quick word on what you said. I'm operating also in Africa. And in some countries, it's quite hard. It's not easy. Because the cycle is oftentimes the same. So the value creation locally in the countries is not high enough. To finance all the needs, countries go through debt, and at some point there is no way they can pay back. So when you want to take out your money, you have problems. So I think it's not the same issue when you have large project. If you do, I don't know what you do exactly, but let's say you do infrastructure, then the type of financing you can have is different, because it can go through foreign financing or large financing. While when you sell small products, it's a different story. So I think it's not the same answer depending on the type of business you have, but we also have hard time in some countries for this lack of foreign currency when you do business. Coming back to your question on SMEs, I think it's a long process, long-term process. It's not a short process. The percentage of companies that are not in the formal sector, it's about 30% of the business, let's say, if you take it. Yeah. This tends to reduce, but we're trying to give incentives to companies to get into the formal sector. One incentive is what we were talking about, which is social security, because then it's employees that ask companies to be totally declared, pay their taxes, declare their employees, etc., because they push for it, because there is an incentive. Two, it's the financing. So if you want to get financing, you have to be formal. But it's not, we will not have an answer in 1 year or 2 years. And we have feedback, experiences, and benchmarks from other countries. So one experience is in Mexico, where in Mexico they managed to get everyone, or almost everyone, within the formal sector quite quickly through financial inclusion. Same in Kenya with the example of M-Pesa. They have access to data on almost all the companies, so that make quicker the process of companies to get into the formal sector. So we're conscious of the problem. We are getting there. I don't know how long it will take, but there is also a social aspect to it.
Can I add something? The reason why I talked about crowdfunding, it's not because it's for startups, but because from day one, if you want to be eligible to a platform and get financing either through capital or loans or even donation, you have to be structured. So it's a way. It doesn't mean that we. It's a way to encourage entrepreneurs to start their business in a formal way. And if we want to, and we really want this tool, and it will be experience, and I hope that in the future years we can talk about how we handle. We really want it to be as inclusive as possible, to have platform also financing in all regions, financing in the rural areas. So we are going to start with, it's new. This is why, as a regulator in capital markets that usually deals with institutional investors, IPOs, securitization, private equity at more, at different levels, to have to tackle these new and find really new financing for entrepreneurs. And we have, for instance, for equity platform, we have put the limit, really the same limits that we can find in Europe, $500, which is quite, for equity, which is quite an amount. So it's a way of encouraging the newcomers to start being formal. So that would be my answer. Thank you.
Wait, she's on the...
Can I just very briefly on the BRICS question, since none of my colleagues seem to want to get back to that. So the financing needs to meet the SDGs are vast. For infrastructure alone, we've estimated it takes 8.2% of global GDP. Now, some of that is inflated because governments subsidize and governments allow monopolies to extract rents. But even if you have the best policies, there's 4.5% of global GDP needed to meet the SDGs. There is plenty of room for the World Bank, for the AFDB, for my many colleagues, as well as for the BRICS banks and other BRICS initiatives. So every cent going towards the SDGs is welcome.
I'll answer the SME in particular, particularly from the Indian context. We have also come through a similar journey in SME financing in India. But what has made it much more simpler is that visibility of their turnover and visibility of their raw material consumption, which we have got credible data available through the GST. So that has lent a lot of credibility, and we're in a position to put in that as a part of the decision engine itself. So that is, I think it is much better than even what the credit rating agencies rate a particular entity. So I think this is something which has helped the country. And the second question, which was relating to the cost of capital relating to the developing world, as a banker, we do experience such challenges, and we are essentially looking at some kind of a multilateral bodies guarantees, which helps us in achieving some kind of parity in terms of the cost of capital, and which eventually works when it comes to competition of IRR also. But yes, of course, what Mr. Subramanian was mentioning, that is the philosophy of how the MDG will also handle those risks which will be sitting on their balance sheets. So I think it's going to be a blend of both, which will eventually help in solving these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a last question there, please.
So first of all, I want to ask to thank the eminent speakers for their speech. My question is for, we are speaking about the reviving growth with inclusivity, but we forget the women and the young people who have a great role to play in the society, because in order to make them participate in that reviving, we have to think of them. So my question, how we can make to achieve that objective and make that categories of society to participate to grow that reviving growth. Thank you very much.
It's clear. Thank you. Maham, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Boubacar. I am a former World Bank staff and also former African Development Bank staff. And currently I am chairman of a board of directors of a bank in Africa, in Mali. We really thank CII for inviting us for this seminar. What we are trying to do now in Africa is also to take initiative to think for ourselves. Because most of the time, we went through all this process because people had taken monopoly of thinking in the place of Africans. So we visited many of these BRICS countries, particularly India. We found a lot of similarities between Africa and India. And we believe that we should even learn how to work with the BRICS. It will be disastrous for any African countries to go and try to negotiate with any of these BRICS countries alone. We have to unite and to come and see how best we can put our interests on the table. And second, we have to learn to think in a very autonomous manner and learn from the best examples. I was very happy to note all these huge resources that the international community is hastening for Africa. But let me confide in you, because I was attending this emerging market forum. A former prime minister, put a very good example there, which I would like to share with you. Frankly speaking, sometimes we don't need the resources in Africa. We have the resources. We have a country where the prime minister that, based on the iron oil, the reserve of bauxite that they have, every year they can generate alone $5 billion in one single African country. So what we have as major problem is leadership and governance issues. And sometimes these governance issues are being imposed by external factors, very deep. So that's the reason why we would like to partner with independent and regional think tanks so that we come up on the tables with some proposals to find solutions to our problems. And last point, all these resources, usually they will say, okay, put it at the World Bank, they are well equipped. We would like to invite that you also look at the regional development banks. It's very important that they also get a very good share of these financial resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boubacar. It's more a comment than a question, so let me thank you. I'm asked by the organizers, so I'm also under pressure to keep time. So thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you.